Hi, welcome to what I'm now going to call a series on my YouTube channel entitled Woefully Underproduced. The point being, I don't know much about video production. I like making music much better. So it's a series of videos that impart my understanding of music technology. Hopefully you get something out of it, but don't expect any bells and whistles, right? So today's episode, we're going to focus on the Digitakt, but specifically how I interface it with my modular system. I've been into modular for almost 5 years now, and I've had a lot of different devices in my rack, particularly sequencers and both melodic and gate sequencers. But those are all gone now, and I use just the Digitakt. So there's a lot of little tips and tricks that you may not know about, and I hope to impart that wisdom upon you. And hopefully, if you have a Digitakt and some modular gear, you can get a lot out of this video. So the first thing to talk about probably is the Digitakt itself, in case you don't know how it works, and maybe you're thinking about getting one. So the easiest way to think about it, there's a lot of different modes we can get in where these buttons do different things, but the most straightforward way of thinking of it is the fact that this top row is 8 tracks of samples, right? So different sample on each track. And when we select a track, we can go into all kinds of different editing modes. So here's a step sequence mode where you can program what steps you want the sample to trigger upon, right? So that's one way of looking at it. But then in addition to these 8 sample tracks, you have 8 MIDI tracks. So this is where it becomes incredibly valuable when we're talking about controlling a modular. So if you also don't know how MIDI works, the best part about MIDI is that it can send on different channels, like up to 16 different channels. So if we program each of these MIDI tracks to send on a different channel, we could have, 8 different synths being controlled by this one machine. And that's what really makes it incredible to work with in terms of modular. But, the first thing that you're really going to need is some kind of MIDI to CV converter, because there's no way to control straight up raw oscillators in Eurorack with just MIDI. There might be maybe 1 or 2 modules that I can't think of any off the top of my head that have a direct MIDI input, but for the most part, it's all CV controlled. That's the beauty of modular. So the first thing that I got to interface with the Digitakt was this guy, the cv.ocd. It's a small little standalone box. It has its own power supply, and it's relatively cheap. I think the price now, I just checked recently, it's $125. I think I got it for less, and the price might have gone up recently, but it's quite fantastic, and it does a whole bunch of things, and it could be configured in many different ways. So the cv.ocd is highly configurable. You can set it up in many different ways, and it's pretty easy to do so. But let's talk about the interface itself. First of all, we have MIDI input. So MIDI from a keyboard, MIDI from the Digitakt, whatever you put it in here, and then it gets converted into all kinds of different signals. These groupings are important. So first of all, we have A, B, C, and D. These output pitch CV, or basically continuous CV of some kind that has a larger range than the other outputs. Outputs 1, 2, 3, and 4 are what we would call gate outputs, and then the remaining 8 outputs are for triggers. So let's try to understand this. Gate is a signal that when you hold down the button, the output will remain high for the duration of the button press. Triggers don't hold, so they would shoot out a little blip of CV whenever you push a button. And those are for like triggering sample modules, drum modules. You could trigger envelopes with them, but you won't get the sustain of an envelope without a gate. So that's an important distinction. This is output A, B, C, and D. Like I said, this is output 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4 are tied to A, B, C, and D respectively. So A1 is a pair, B2 is a pair, C3 is a pair, D4 is a pair. At least that's how I set it up. And what that means is that you could get CV gate outputs, which are the traditional sequencer type of outputs. So you can program a melodic sequence, get the gates to fire envelopes, and you could have different sustain times on each of them, etc., etc. But you could also configure B, C, D, or even A to different kinds of CV output, like velocity or the mod wheel or pitch wheel of a keyboard. So again, it's highly configurable, but what I like about it is because I have multiple oscillators in my system, I can basically get 4 different sequences of 4 different voices at any one given time. So I have, in my configuration of this device, I have MIDI channel 1 sending to A1, MIDI channel 2 sending to B2, so on and so forth. Channels 5 through 12 I have tied to the triggers here. So when you think about how that works with the Digitakt, it's pretty amazing. So I can have up to 8 MIDI tracks doing all kinds of things on the cv.ocd. So perhaps I have 1 volt per octave melodic sequence on A1, but then I have some kind of rhythm pattern firing out of gates 5 and 6, triggers 5 and 6, let's say. The other crazy thing about this section is that you could actually have different triggers fire on different MIDI notes. So what that means is that you could actually save the majority of the Digitakt's MIDI tracks for other tasks, right? So let's say we set up this trigger output to be C0, C1, C2, C3, so on and so forth, right? So when you press that note on a keyboard or on a sequencer, it will fire that trigger. That way we can send it on a single MIDI channel. So it would be channel 5, but all those different notes would fire different triggers. That's a complicated way to sequence a drum pattern, so that's why I don't do it that way. It would just take a lot of things to remember and a lot of careful programming, but it's kind of easy at the same time. So it depends on your needs, right? And, you know, the same dude who makes this also makes this MIDI splitter here, which is great. And that's another way to control external synths. I have the neutron, I have dark energy. So any kind of things that you want to sequence with MIDI, the Digitakt could do that as well, which is what makes it a really strong central hub or brain of any given setup. But I particularly like it with modular because of this, right? So the only real downside so far, and something that I'm still really, really waiting for, is that the Digitakt does not have re-trigger functions, right? So on the MIDI channels, I mean. So with the samples, you could get that kind of ratcheting stutter to any of the given sample tracks, but you can't do that specifically with the MIDI tracks for some reason. And I really, really hope Electron changes that someday. You can still do parameter locking, probability, slipping triggers off the grid, right? You could do a lot of good stuff with the MIDI sequencing on the Digitakt, but for some reason they did not include that kind of re-triggering, beat repeat, ratcheting, whatever you want to call it. So that's unfortunate, but otherwise this is pretty sweet. And so if you notice, my cv.ocd is not set up right now. Nothing's plugged into it. And that's because, I'll show you. That's because Hexinverter has created the Mutant Brain, which is pretty much not even pretty much, it is an exact port of the cv.ocd in a very small module. It's only 8 HP. So you plug the MIDI in right there, and you have the same kind of outputs. A, B, C, and D are grouped up there on top. And so those are the CV outputs, and then you have the gates 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the triggers for the rest of the module. So I bought that because I thought, wow, that would be cool to just show up to a gig or something and not have to bring extra box and an extra power supply. It's just all right there, ready to go. So that MIDI cable that you see plugged in there, that's output of the Digitakt output A, right? So the Digitakt has 2 MIDI outputs, and they're both configurable in different ways, but it's just the standard MIDI A output that I have plugged in here. And again, when I set up the different channels on each MIDI track of the Digitakt, they control different outputs of the Mutant Brain. So that's kind of it. I mean, you know, in the sense of how this all works and the way that I do this, but there's some other little tips and tricks that I have. So let me show you some of those. So here's the major trick that I'm kind of proud of for using, and I feel pretty clever about. You could take this MIDI through port. That's its default function. It passes the MIDI through the Digitakt if you have a MIDI in, which I do, but we'll get to that later. But instead of using this port for MIDI through, I use it for DIN sync. DIN sync is a clock signal that's sent over a DIN cable, right? Which is what these MIDI cables are called. So instead of using this port for MIDI through, I use it for DIN sync. Now, you could set up these trigger outputs on the cv.ocd to be clock outputs, and certainly, you know, analog clock pulses are highly useful in modular. But if you use DIN sync and you buy a special cable and you have modules that are relative to this, it's kind of awesome. So let me show you that in terms of my rack and what I have. So this is Pamela's workout. It's one of my faves, and it's pretty straightforward, but very, very useful. With that segmented display, you could set a BPM and then hit the yellow start-stop button. And when it's running, these 8 outputs will output a clock signal, but you could edit each output to be either a multiplication or division of the master BPM. So you could get all kinds of different rates going. And this is Pamela's workout version number 2, where in addition to clock signals at the 8 outputs, you get the opportunity to output timed modulation signals, so timed LFOs that are rhythmically synced with the master BPM, etc., etc. But the cool thing about it is that both modules can be externally clocked. And so the inputs that I have here are both the clock input and the run input. And they're being fed by this cable here. Let's see if I could get you a good shot of that. There it is. This cable is made by Expert Sleepers, and what it does is it takes a DIN sync signal and splits it into 2 separate signals. One that's good for clock, and one that's good for run. So basically, by using the MIDI B output as DIN sync on the Digitakt, and this kind of slightly contrived concoction of coupler cables and then these stackables, I'm able to press play on the Digitakt and get both Pamela's workouts to start running. So let me show you. Ready? There you go. I press play on the Digitakt, and now we've got the beat running from the Digitakt, and Pam is right in time with it. So what that means is that I can then distribute these clock signals that are perfectly in time with the Digitakt to all kinds of other modules. Like I could clock the tempi, I could clock the wobbler, I could clock a delay, which I don't have right now, but all kinds of things, right? And anything that requires a clock signal can be perfectly synced with the Digitakt without sacrificing a trigger input from the Mutant Brain. And that also means that my modulation that comes out of the PAM's new version is perfectly in time with the Digitakt as well. So I think this is one of the coolest ways to interface a modular system with the Digitakt. I have one more trick though, and it's pretty sweet. So the last trick with the Digitakt and the modular is a trick that allows the Digitakt to be a more hands-on, jammable controller than just a sequencer. So first of all, we're on MIDI track 1, and MIDI track 1 is sending on MIDI channel 1, and we can enter step record mode and put in triggers and run the sequence, and everything will be cool that way. But two things. One, if we hold down function and hit track, this turns into a 1-octave keyboard. So I could start jamming, etc. And right now I have the Mutant Brain sending CV to the Mangrove, which is plugged into the Linux VCA, and make noise function is acting as the envelope, which is being triggered by gate number 1. So just like that, it works. And the other thing about the Digitakt is that you can hold down record and press play, and now you're in live record mode, so you can jam in a little melody, and depending on how many steps of your sequence you have running, it'll record it and play it back. So that's a really, really cool way to interact with the modular. You could just jam in a sequence and get it to play back. But there's a thing called, on the Digitakt, called autochannel. And basically, you could set it up to be any channel that you want, but by default it's channel 14. And what that means is when a MIDI signal comes into the Digitakt on channel 14, it'll play whatever track you have highlighted. So right now we have MIDI track 1 highlighted, but we can easily switch it to channel, track 2, so on and so forth. But what I'm getting at is if you plug in an external MIDI controller into the MIDI in of the Digitakt and set that controller to send on channel 14, you can then control whatever track you have highlighted. So I have an Alesis keyboard here, and I'm setting it to channel 14, and so now I have, 40 whatever keys to control my modular, which could also still be live recorded. Pretty cool. So I think that's about it. That's how I use the Electron Digitakt as a hub for my modular. It's replaced all the sequencers I've ever had, and I was just about to get an Eloquencer, and then I realized what I could do with the Digitakt, and I abandoned that idea. It still has its limitations. I wish there was the retrig function on the MIDI sequences, and hopefully someday Electron will hook us up with that. But until then, 4 tracks of CV gate, and then a whole bunch of triggers that could be used to trigger envelopes. They could be used to advance something like the mimetic digitalis. But then we also have this DIN sync that can clock pretty much everything in the system between these two PAM modules, it's pretty invaluable as far as I'm concerned. So that's it. Stay tuned for further episodes of Woefully Produced. And if you want me to dive into something that's in my rack, let me know, and I'll do a video for it. See you later.